Hi, welcome. My name is Cheryl. I'm from Tiny Modernist, and today we are going to learn how to do a cross stitch drum finish. The one we're using is the part 1 chart from the Sleepy Hollow series that is running this year, 2019. So you can sign up for it on my website, tinymodernist.com, or certainly at your local or online needle shop. And the drum finish is the alternate finish. You can certainly choose to stitch it as a large sampler piece, or you can do each section as a drum with the bonus circle design on the top. Or you can get very adventurous and do both. The reason I'm calling it a stackable drum is because I envisioned it either sort of on its own. This is a candle holder, which I liked as a display option. But I envision the parts being able to stack on top of each other, so you can put 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 together and have a nice sort of three-dimensional Halloween decoration for your house. Okay, to start off, I'm going to go over the supplies you'll need for this project if you're going to do the drum. This part 1 from the Sleepy Hollow series, we stitched on Oaken from Picture This Plus. It's 32 count linen. And we've stitched the entire part 1 design plus the bonus circular design for the top of the drum. So that's the finished stitching that you'll need for this. And on the main body of the drum, you'll see here I've done a back stitch line 1 stitch away from the design all the way around, so completing the entire outside of the design here. This is going to be our stitching line. So you'll need to do that as well. You don't need to stitch on the top because we're gonna actually take our stitches in the fabric. But you will need to cut a second square piece with no stitching that will form the bottom of the drum. So you'll need these 3 pieces of fabric, and I've also used some interfacing on the back of the main design. I used a lightweight woven fusible, so it's ironed on the back here. And I cut it to fit just inside, roughly, just inside the stitching line, because I'm going to be folding back the excess here to form our seam allowance. So that's all the prep you need for the fabric. Some other things you'll need are, you'll need 2 circles in mat board. What I've also cut out are some matching batting pieces. This is just lightweight quilt batting that I purchased and cut to fit. We're going to use a glue stick later on to glue those together. So the other thing we'll need is some floss to stitch it together. I think I forgot to mention earlier I'm using 422, which matched pretty well to the Oaken fabric we've used here. You'll also need some fabric scissors, your snips, a ruler. That's mostly to measure the size of the fabric and also to get the dimensions for your circles. And lastly, at the final step, you'll need some polyfill, if that's what you're choosing to fill with, which we are today. So those are all our supplies. And then in the next segment, we will start the stitching. Okay, so this is going to be our first stitching step. So what we want to do before we start stitching is to flip our piece over, and we're going to finger press the seam allowance down right along the stitching line. It just helps the final design lay a bit flatter, and when you're stitching it's much easier to see the stitching line if the seam allowance is pushed back. And the nice thing about linen and Aida cloth is that really it makes a nice crease just with your fingers. You don't really have to use an iron to press back the seam allowance. Okay, so I finger pressed the seam allowance down here, and I'll flip it over so you can see what it'll eventually look like. And what we're going to do is stitch the 2 short ends together with a whip stitch. And this is going to give us a little circle. So we're going to match our pieces here, and I've already pre-threaded a needle with that. Well, I'm using the loop method, so it's like 2 strands. And the first thing we're going to do, I'll zoom in here so you can see, Actually, the first thing I'm going to do is take a little stitch in the back to secure my thread. Since I have a loop here, I'm just going to go through the loop. It's a tiny little stitch that's going to hold it in place. I'll take a second little tiny stitch. Make sure when you do that you're not stitching onto your piece that's going to show. I did that right in the seam allowance. Now I'm going to bring my floss back up to the front. Alright, so now we can start stitching the two pieces together using a whip stitch. So if you can see, I'm going to take one stitch on the other side, pull it through. Now I'm just going to continue taking a stitch on one side, stitch through the other side. Now keep in mind I'm stitching through the floss, not the fabric here. It may be hard to see because the floss matches so closely, but I'm not actually pulling a stitch through the fabric here. Yeah. And you can start to see it kind of makes a little like a ladder looking thing. I should mention I'm using a sewing needle here, not a stitching needle. It's quite helpful when you do this whip stitch to have a pointier needle. It's less likely to catch your fabric, and it goes underneath these tiny stitches so much easier than a cross stitch or embroidery needle. Okay, so I've finished stitching the line here. Just to finish it off, I took an extra little knot inside here, and the next step is going to be to add the top and the bottom. And now we're going to work on getting the top piece stretched around this circle. I've already done the bottom piece, so we're going to make it match. This again had no stitching on it, so it was easy enough to do. We're going to gather the fabric at the back, trim the excess, and end up with this lovely little piece here. So in order to do that, I've taken the mat board and just the glue stick, an acid-free glue stick, craft glue, and I've glued the piece of batting to it. I also just gave it a little bit of a trim so there's no batting hanging over the edge. Now I'm going to place, this order is important, so this is the back of my stitching, and I'm going to place this with the batting side towards the stitching. So when you flip it over, you're going to end up with a nice soft piece here like that. Because we're using embroidery floss, it's not super strong. I've had it break before when I've used a single thread, so I've doubled this up again with the loop method. And I'm going to just do a basting stitch about a ½ inch or so away from the outside of the mat board, and I'm going to start to gather as I go. I think what I may do actually first is just trim it a little bit. There. So it's just a rough circle. And now I'm going to start to just do my basting stitch. So of course the first thing you want to do is a little knot. So again, I'm just going to run my thread through the loop. I'm going to take a second small stitch just to secure the thread. Okay. And then I'm going to just start doing like a running stitch, a basting stitch all the way around. So these are sort of bigger stitches, maybe 3/8, somewhere between 1/4 and 3/8. Starting to gather nicely. Okay, so I've made it all the way around the circle. Now what I want to do is flip it over before I tie up the knot. I'm going to flip it over and just see how centered we are. So I'm going to pinch where that thread is to not lose it. And we're not bad. We're not bad. I'm just going to shift it over slightly. What do you think? That isn't bad. I usually just eyeball things. There we go. All right, so now I'm just going to pull this tight, but not like too tight to break the thread. So pull it tight enough. And then I am going to just put my finger right where the thread is like this so that it doesn't get lost or get loosened while I'm tying this. And now I'm going to just make a knot here. So I take a little stitch, put my thread through the loop, one more. I like to do two just to secure it. There. And you can just snip your thread and we have a top. Look at that. Nice little disc shape. Okay, so I've pinned it together. I started where the seam was and pinned it sort of at quarter of the circle intervals around, just to make sure that as I'm stitching, I'm getting it sort of lined up properly. And with the thread this time, I've still used 2 threads, but I've actually taken 2 full threads instead of folding it in half for the loop method. I wanted some longer thread to make sure, hopefully, we can get around the entire circle without having to change threads. So I've tied a decent sized knot in there. Now I'm going to start stitching where my seam allowance was from the bottom part. So again, the first thing you want to do is take a little stitch inside the seam allowance so that your knot and everything is hidden in here. So I've secured my thread. I'm going to take a stitch in the drum body through the back stitch line. And here's where it differs a little bit because we don't have a stitching line in the top piece. We're going to make our own. So I'm going to take a stitch through a couple of threads up here. And then we're just going to keep going. I'm going to take a stitch through the back stitch line on the body and then a few stitches in the top piece. And while I do this, I'm going to make sure I hide the knot in the seam allowance. All right, you guys, I'm coming up on the halfway point here, and I'm so happy with the way it's looking. I've sort of gotten into a rhythm here, so I wanted to show you how it's working. I'm finding the easiest thing is to hold the mat board and take the stitches from the drum side. So I'll see if I can show you how this is working. Yeah, it seems to be stitching up really, really nicely. You can see the edge is really crisp. Really, it's floppy right now, but once we stuff it, I think it's going to be a really, really nice fit. All right, well, I'm going to keep going, and I'll pause it here, and when I get to the end, I'll show you how to do the bottom side of the drum, okay? Here we are, we're about to finish stitching the bottom, so you can see the top has already been put on. I'm about a quarter of the way through stitching the bottom here, and I wanted to give you an idea of what it's looking like here. You can already see the beautiful shape we're getting. So with the bottom, we need to work our way around. I'm going to stop stitching here to leave like a little space, and then we're going to stuff it at that point, and then I'll continue stitching along. Okay, so I've reached the final pin as I was stitching along the bottom. So it's almost together. The last step, as I mentioned, was to stop and leave a little bit of a gap so we can fill it. So we've got a little bit of a hole here, and I'm going to start just to stuff it with some fiber fill. All right, starting to get there. I'm going to stuff a little bit more, and then I'll show you the finished product. Thank you for watching. If you followed along, you should have finished a drum. Well, I really hope that this tutorial inspired you to try something that perhaps you haven't done before. It's actually quite a straightforward, easy finish once you know all the steps. So I appreciate you watching, and please join us on another video for more tutorials. You can follow us on Facebook, on Instagram. I have a very friendly Facebook group if you want to join and show your whips or finish work or see what other people are doing. Please join us there, and take care, everyone. We'll see you in the next video. Okay, bye-bye.